the 2AC to water privatization. Sorry about the nearly 9-minute PMC. Thanks to my colleague Jared, who's taken a difficult side of this topic and helped to clarify a lot of the issues that our competitors are going to see when debating this topic. I'm very proud to propose this topic because, as of right now, there is no offense against the case thesis, which is that water is a fundamental human right. We understand at this point in the debate that local control is always better. Additionally, that there's no risk in removing the mandate. So let me be clear about the plan text right here, which is that the mandate is that SAPs, or structural adjustment programs, will no longer require that the natural resource water will be privatized before a development loan will be given, right? Additionally, notice that our solvency story isn't about solving all of the world's problems as it relates to water. It isn't about getting rid of corruption, although we think we have a pretty good mechanism to do so. We also don't get any solvency on world peace or global warming. The case tells a simple story about before you get a loan to make hospitals happen, to make schools or sewers or roads happen, for example, in your country, should you have to privatize your water to do so? Should that be mandated? Our argument and analogy in this debate is that development loans are being held hostage, and the ransom is the privatization of water. My opponent's first arguments are non-uniques. The first one is that there's a pressure for profit, and Jared says that this happens in all situations. He then drops down and says that poor folks are also forgotten about frequently. It's non-unique to water privatization. Please group these together. My first response is a theory argument, which is that non-uniques are not offense. They're defense at best. These are not reasons why the case is a bad idea. I'm going to be getting uniqueness off of neocolonialism, on water being a human right, on the solvency that Shiva gets, and also on Amartya Sen, somebody I'm going to reference in a second. Also on jurisdiction and the way that jurisdiction is going to get solvency here. The next point is Amartya Sen's Development is Freedom book. Amartya Sen won the Nobel Prize in Economics in the late 80s, like 1988 or something like that. And the argument that Sen makes in Development is Freedom is that we are going to develop, and the question is whose interests are going to be reflected in the development. Is it going to be foreign powers or local interests? Is it going to be the colonizer or the colonial or the colony's interests that are going to be reflected there? Also, Sen is critical of development for the sake of development, right? This is the idea that a country should go into debt and have the fanciest water tech just for the sake of having it, right? But that's not really. They have access to lots of clean water, and the real problem then is the debt that gets created to have that technology. Instead, what Sen would say is that we should put our resources and development into processes or exercises of freedom, which would be things like develop more food security so that people have a reliable source of food, or developing infrastructure so that natural resources aren't as much of a threat to communities, right? These are mechanisms that solve. This is a mechanism where development can solve the problems of the future. Additionally, we're removing a structural problem that's going to create more conflict in the future, because we are ensuring that more development is going to make more access to these natural resources, reducing the option or the possibility of conflict in the future. The next point is that in undeveloped places, water costs 6 times the amount that it does in developed places. We don't disagree with this. As a matter of fact, this is a great example for the affirmative side of the topic, right? The distinction here is not that privatization makes water more efficient or less expensive. Development does. Pipes do. More sophisticated tech does. That's not because of privatization. That's because of development. We are pro-development, right? That means we like pipes. We want more sewers. We want more technology, but not technology for the sake of technology, right? Again, think of the examples that we give in the 1AC, which are we don't want fences or private armies to protect bodies of water and limit people's ability to access bodies of water that they'd normally be able to access in a particular area, right? So some communities don't actually want or need pipes, and instead a lower tech option is better for them, and especially an option that doesn't put that community into debt. That's the real sort of cost-benefit analysis of that policy. So the distinction is development good, but development is freedom. That's part of the affirmative today. The next argument is maintenance, and that maintenance favors the affluent. Again, Jared makes a non-unique. Please cross-apply the non-unique as defense argument. The next response here that I want is a turn, which is that local is better, right? Because of jurisdiction, I'm actually going to make this argument twice on the flow today. Because jurisdiction always functions through a nation-state system, right, through sovereignty, always better on a local system. And the scenario that I would pose to you is, if there's corruption or a grievance or something that you have with your water provider, who do you take? If it's a multinational corporation, who do you take your grievance to? The ICJ or the World Court? The answer is that there is no jurisdiction for these situations, and that's one of the main criticisms of water privatization. The next argument is Bolivia. Jared says that I'm cherry-picking examples, and he says that the riots in Bolivia prove that people will rise up and that my case is irrelevant, that there's no need for my case. I don't agree with this logic at all. First of all, if it is true, right, that riots will solve the problem, then what's the risk in eliminating the mandate? Why can't we say that structural adjustment programs should not require that water is privatized before a loan will be given? The next point I want to make here is that Jared acknowledges the problem, right? He says that riots solve the problem. Why pose the question, what problem are we discussing? The problem that SAP structurally created tension, which is a mandate over privatizing that water, and then there's going to be poor services such that people have to riot. That's the framing of my opponent, right? I don't need anything else except for his framing of that information. The next response I want is a turn, which is that riots are bad and they're not helpful to the long-term sustainable democratic processes. I'll give you a few examples, which are, first, that people are hurt and killed often in riots. Next, that this is an excuse for increased militarism from the police. And lastly, there's very little dialogue that happens in riots, which is a problem, which means that there's an opportunity for these problems to happen again in the future. Our argument is that more dialogue is going to be helpful to eliminating these problems in the future. On to advantages. My opponent says that we need to look to how water is managed. We agree with this. As a matter of fact, the whole case is about water management. The next response is turn, which is that developed countries unfairly have been able to develop their infrastructure based on exploitative economic models. The example that we've already discussed is colonies, but the other example that I need here, and I think this is a really easy example, is the economic empire that was created because of slavery in the United States. So, then, the turn is that neocolonialism is a criticism of this framework. The neem tree example that we give in the 1AC is an example of a neo-colonial, a new way of doing colonial assertion of power in terms of IPRs, or intellectual property rights. Those are the international legal agreements that protect property, and the privatization of natural resources. In the case debate, we're talking about the privatization of water. The next argument here is corruption. Jared says that this is non-unique, that this both happens before and after water privatization. Non-unique is defense. Secondly, turn, that local is always better. Please cross-apply the jurisdiction court example here. Again, right, this is the cross-application. If you have a grievance, who are you going to take that grievance to? The ICJ or the World Court? There is no current sort of jurisdictional structure that has any sort of authority. The next response here is access, and this is a really good example for the affirmative. Jared says that between 1991 and 2007, a small number of people turned into a large number of people in terms of who had access to water. But you have to understand, this is not because of privatization. This is because at that time, there was a lot of development that was happening. Remember that we are very pro-development. We want those pipes. A metaphor that I would offer is like the internet was being developed at a similar time, right? But it's not because of privatization that the internet was able to catch on. It was because the internet is a piece of technology that takes time to integrate into different societies at a different rate. So it makes sense in a similar example to water, because we see this ramp up in water engineering technology take place after World War II, that there's a certain time process that's necessary to happen before these water technologies make their way to the developing world. So this access between 1991 and 2007 is not privatization good, it's development good. That's the affirmative side of the topic. How do you evaluate, Jared, my opponent, then next asks, how do you evaluate human life compared to philosophical concepts? He poses the question, how do we understand or how do we evaluate neocolonialism? I'll tell you. First, there's no explanation for why the negative team somehow affirms human life and I don't, and the AF team doesn't. As a matter of fact, it's quite the opposite. The whole first 7 minutes of this round is dedicated to affirming human life and eliminating the risks that are associated with water privatization. The other example that I'll give is local control, community ethics, and how we are pro-development, right? These are all opportunities to understand how a philosophical concept applies to actionable policy items. The next response is that neocolonialism provides us with a tool set, a new way of thinking about how we can understand these solutions in a new way. The examples that we've already discussed in terms of solutions that I'll give you are Vandana Shiva, Amartya Sen, and development as freedom, water as a fundamental human right, how jurisdiction functions in the court system. These are all affirmative arguments. The next response here is a turn, is that the neocolonial perspective is understanding the neocolonial perspective is an opportunity for us to decrease conflict. Please cross-apply the economics as exploitative systems argument that I made earlier on the advantage. The disadvantage, masking. Jared's first argument here is a link, right? He says the alternative to SAPs are PRSPs, Poverty Reduction Strategy Papers. The problem is that we don't get rid of SAPs, and so I think the most logical argument is a no link, right? We keep SAPs, we just remove one mandate of SAPs. The next thing that Jared goes for here is that PRSPs are, I guess he's saying that this is bad. It seems to me that this is good, right? But that the identity and the community are a part of the process in constructing these. I don't understand how this fits into the debate. I think that my opponent needs to spend more time on this before he gets to have any offense or garner any offense off of this. The internal link quickly transitions into the impact story, which is that there's a lack of discussion. So there's 2 points here and then a turn. The 2 background points. The first background point is that the PRSPs are criticized because of the conditionality, the ongoing conditionality of the loans, and that oftentimes the conditionality changes after the loan has been given, right? The second point, so an example is that we give you a loan and we say this under these particular sets of circumstances, and then afterwards we say, oh, and also this other thing, and then countries are upset about that. The second thing is that, ironically, that PRSPs are notoriously difficult to enforce, and so SAPs are actually a more sophisticated legal mechanism or legal tool that has more legal teeth, right, more weight behind it, and they're stronger. So ironically, PRSPs allow for much more access to freedom for local countries, right? So that's actually the turn. Turn is that PRSPs allow for greater amounts of freedom for local countries and much more difficult enforcement mechanisms for the donor countries as opposed to the donee. And the second point here is that the donors are exclusively other countries, not multinational corporations. And this is very significant, right? This means that in the all politics is local argument that I'm making at other places in the flow, please cross-apply the all politics is local argument here, which is that we could theoretically we don't have a great political system in the United States, but if the United States was a donor country, we theoretically could have some sort of local control and influence our policymakers, influence over those requirements, right, in the PRSP scenario. So we actually get a turn on that. Thank you.